Hello, my name is Jonica Hope, and my address is 101 Ashton Avenue, Clever, Missouri 65631. I am a resident in District 139. Jared Taylor is my representative, and Senate District 20 with Eric Burleson as my senator. I would be there in person today, but I teach locally, and unfortunately, we have a lot of teachers out today, so I could not get a sub. With that in mind, I am testifying on behalf of the bill concerning visitors in ICU and COVID units across the state. My father, Keith Beasley, passed away on March the 6th of this year from COVID. My father was a very strong man. He was a hunter. He was a fisherman. He loved being outdoors. He should not have had an issue with COVID, but unfortunately we did. COVID is such a strange disease, and of course, only God knows our days. My dad was a good man. He was a believer, but he was afraid of COVID, to be honest with you. Looking at it from a human perspective, my mother was the one we were most concerned about because she's diabetic. She's on dialysis. She has lots of problems. My mother also had COVID at the same time. Both of my parents were in the hospital at the same time, and I am the only child. They were not in the same hospital. My mother was in Cox Hospital. My father was in Mercy Hospital. They were in different hospitals because of insurance policies being different. With that in mind, my father was diagnosed when the rest of our family was on February the 10th of this year with COVID. My mother at the time was already in the hospital for other issues, but she later found out that she was positive a couple of days into her stay. My father did well for the first couple of weeks at home, but then February the 20th, somewhere in there, he called me and said, Jonica, would my phone call 911 if I asked her to? And I said, yeah, but if you're that bad, someone needs to stay with you tonight. You might need to go in. And he said, no, I'm not at that point, but he definitely was concerned. The next day he called me and asked the same question. I told him, Dad, Abby's going to come stay the night with you. And she did. A couple of times throughout that night, she called me. She said, I think it's time Papa goes in because he's having a hard time breathing. And I talked to him. He said, no. In the morning, I want you to take me to the doctor. So this was on Sunday, I think February the 21st. I took him into Mercy Urgent Care, and of course, he was immediately sent to Mercy ER. Now, with this in mind, at that point, my dad had a power of attorney. He has a living will, and he had a will in place, thankfully. The power of attorney was in full effect at this point because my dad was medically incapacitated. My mother as well was medically incapacitated, which means that medical authority came back to me. Also, keep in mind that I'd already come off of my quarantine time about 4 or 5 days prior to this. Is the 14th, so prior to this incident. We get to Mercy, and my father, who was pretty much legally deaf, he had lost 75% of his hearing, and he had a hard time hearing people, was told, your daughter cannot stay with you. Logically, that does not make sense. I'd recently come off of my quarantine. I'd recently been released as per CDC regulations. But even with my father not being able to make medical decisions for himself, even though I was the POA, and even with him having hearing issues, I was not allowed to stay with my father. The last time I physically touched my father when he was alive and alert was that day when I walked out of that hospital, leaving him there after giving him a hug. The look on his face was fear, it was worry, it was concern. And I'll never forget where I stood that day walking out of the ER. As he looked at me, you could tell that he was scared. And my dad, who, like I said, was a big man, he was about in tears. He was later admitted that day, obviously, and things looked okay at the beginning. He looked like he just needed regular support. He started off in a regular COVID unit and was quarantined as per protocol. Again, I was not on quarantine. I had just had COVID. I had just been released as per CDC regulations. My father was denied visitors. He kept asking, I just want to see my family. I just want to see my family. About 3 or 4 days into this, my dad had a angel of a nurse, and I was up there dropping some stuff off to my dad, and she actually came down and met me at the entrance, and she gave me a big hug, and she asked, "You were just released, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And so we got to talking. She said, come with me. And so we headed to the bank of elevators, and I didn't know that she was going to do this, and I don't want to disclose her name because I don't want to get her in trouble, because she did break regulations, but she took me up, and even though I did not get to gown up and I didn't get to go in and see my father, I was able to stand at the door and talk to him through the glass. So that day was pretty good. I only spent probably about 5 minutes with him, dropped things off, but he was all smiles, and he was glad to see his family. Well, a couple of days later, maybe even 24 hours later, he called me and said, "Jonica, I'm not getting any better." At this point, we had had battles with the oxygen levels going down, going up, going down. It's like just back and forth. And by this point, he was put on the BiPAP machine almost all day. And he called me that afternoon. I was on my way home from school, actually, and said, "Jonica, I just want to call and tell you goodbye. I love you, and I'm proud of you, and take care of your mom." And I said, "Dad, don't talk like that. You're going to get better." And he said, "No, I'm not. It's just gradually getting worse, and I just want you to know that." And so I was able to pull over, and I talked to him a few more minutes, probably about 15 minutes. And he gave me a list of people to call. Some of his best friends, some of it was my childhood youth pastor, just various people that meant a lot to him. And he said, "I can't even have a pastor up, and I want to speak to a pastor." And I said, "No, Dad, you can't." And so anyways, I ended that call. I had to call my husband to come get me because I was so upset and couldn't drive. So the next day, which would have been a Friday, this was the first Friday that he was in the hospital, about 5 days after he was admitted, he called me again and basically wanted to talk to my husband, and he started telling my husband about some end-of-life decisions and different things that he wanted to see done and where he could find certain things. My husband and my dad shared a safe, and there was just some paperwork in there that my husband needed to be aware of. So they talked probably a good 10-15 minutes, and that was the last time my husband was able to have a real meaningful conversation with my dad. During that conversation, he kept asking for a pastor. He kept saying, "I'm just so lonely. I want a friend. I want to see you guys. I know I'm not going to get out of here alive. I just want to hug you." He was asking for a pastor. He was scared. And my dad, like I said, he was a big burly guy. He wasn't overweight, but he was very masculine. He had just come off just retired like a year ago in November. He didn't even get a chance to enjoy his retirement. He had worked very hard all of his life for that. I don't ever remember a day that my dad did not work. So that was that Friday. My husband talked to him about his salvation. My dad he was scared. And so that afternoon, we got home, and I called my pastor. And of course, my pastor left a message, and unbeknownst to me, my pastor called him the next morning, which would have been a Saturday morning, and talked to my dad for 45 minutes. My dad was not one to talk on the phone. The 10 and 15 minutes we got was huge because my dad was not one to talk on the phone. So he talked to my pastor for 45 minutes that day about just different things that he was worried about, scared about, just thoughts. Just you're facing death, and so those things just pass through your mind. And he prayed with my pastor and just told my pastor, "I just want to see my family." And so that weekend was really hard. Go through Sunday. And if you remember, at this point, my mother's still in the hospital. At this point, I still have not been able to get into the hospital to see my mother. Again, I'm the only child. And all my parents wanted was to see me. My mother, same situation. She just kept asking, "Can I just see my daughter? Can I just see my daughter? I want to see my husband." But we couldn't get her in to see my dad because she's in the hospital. At this point, she had been actually discharged to the TCU, which is the Transitional Care Unit at Cox, and still hadn't been able to see her. We had window visits